Hey everyone, welcome back to the Indie Composers Podcast. My name is LJ Garcia, and I'm here with my co-host Jon R. Moore. Jon, how are you doing?
So far, so good.
Cool. Today we are super excited to be joined by our special guest Andrew Lockington. Andrew is a film composer whose long list of credits include Rampage, City of Ember, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Journey to the Mysterious Island, Space Between Us, and also the new Netflix series Frontier, as well as many other awesome films. He's received the Breakthrough Composer of the Year award at the International Film Music Critics Awards, numerous BMI and SOCAN Film Music Awards, and has also been nominated for the Discovery of the Year at the World Soundtrack Awards in Ghent, Belgium. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. How are you doing?
I'm doing great, thanks. How are you guys?
Doing excellent.
So far, so good.
Interesting
S-
times, but nice we get a chance to chat today.
mhm,
Absolutely agree. Yeah.
Indeed. So for the first question, uh, how did you get started composing for films?
I was in a band in high school. It's funny, I answered an ad in the classifieds. Even that's actually old now, isn't it? At the back of a newspaper, there was a band looking for a keyboard player, and I answered that ad. And turned out I was 15 at the time. Turned out this was for a band of guys who were they were a professional band in their mid 20s, and I auditioned, and they sort of laughed at this 15-year-old kid auditioning. So I think I did okay, but they were looking for somebody, an adult, someone a little more grown up. And after about 3 weeks, this guy, it was the bass player in the band, shows up at our front door, and my mom answers and he asks for me, and he says, "Oh, any chance Andrew could come and fill in on this gig? Our keyboard player we hired totally crapped out." So I did that and ended up playing with the band my last few years of high school. Um, all the while they had been telling me about the previous guys in their band, the Dana brothers, Michael Dana and Jeff Dana. And so when I expressed an interest at the end of high school of wanting to get into film music, they connected me with those guys who were both working in film and television. And I ended up actually a while later becoming an assistant to Michael and working with Jeff as well. And Michael especially, but both Michael and Jeff were my mentors, and that's how I got into the industry.
That's awesome.
Sweet, sweet, yeah.
So, bridging off of that, I wanted to ask about both Journey to the Center of the Earth films in particular. The theme for both Journey to the Center of the Earth and Journey to the Mysterious Island is really cool and captivating. It stands out. From where did you draw your inspiration when composing themes like Journey to the Center of the Earth and the one for these adventurous kinds of films?
I was a kid growing up with Spielberg films, so I think that style of sort of Americana music, even today, I mean, that really resonated with me. So um, I'd be lying if I didn't say that influenced that movie especially, which in so many ways was influenced by those Spielberg films and Cameron films, etc. Um, and just the interesting thing, I remember when I was writing those themes and that the main theme that exists in both films, trying to come up with something that was a bit of an earworm, but also felt like a conversation. I find the best themes when you're humming them, you need a moment to kind of end a phrase. And because even if in your head, if you're humming something, if the phrase doesn't have the same length as a sentence or as a sung phrase, it becomes less appealing. So I was trying to find something that had this sort of commas within it, and and it was funny because I remember writing that. It was the first Journey film was my first big studio film. It was a big break for me. I was really fortunate to get hired on that, and so I had put so much pressure on myself. I definitely was overthinking it. And then that was one of those things that after, I'm just sitting there grinding, going through all these ideas and panicking a little bit, I just kind of thought, you just sat down and sort of on a whim kind of played something that was really close to that theme and thought, oh, maybe that's cool, but not for this film. And then went back to it later and said, hey, this is the best thing I've got for this. I should explore this. So it ended up being something that was pretty versatile because it can be in a very two-dimensional sort of swashbuckling fun way, but it translated well into more emotional, dramatic writing as well. So I find that's so much of my time, as I'm sure you guys find the same thing. When you're writing something, you think, okay, yeah, I've got something great for this scene, but how is this going to translate? How can it evolve? How can it work in all these other different ways? Because so much of the trick of scoring for films, when you do it in the traditional sense of theme writing, is to allow your audience to experience that theme in so many different incarnations so that they don't feel this sense of repetitiveness. They don't feel like they're hearing the same thing over and over and over. You're
Yeah.
almost tricking them into internalizing a melody, and not realizing that they've heard it so many different times, if that makes any sense.
That does. Yeah, that's cool.
I equate it to when I used to buy an album from a band I loved, and they'd have a new album get released, and it was the big day, and you download it, or when I was young, you buy the CD, and you pop it in, and you think, what happened? These guys were so good. What happened? They were amazing, and now this is terrible. And then if you put the time in and listen to the music 5 or 6 times, after hearing it 5 or 6 times, you start to internalize it and latch on to elements within it. And I feel like theme writing's the same. You almost have to replicate that experience of going from hearing at the beginning of the film, you might hear the theme and it might mean nothing to you. But when you need it to be this really emotional hook at the end of a storyline or at the climax of the film, if the audience has experienced it along the way, it's going to be that much more potent.
I remember watching the director and Brendan Fraser did a commentary on one of the discs that
Yeah.
on the film, and they talked about you and how that was your first big film debut.
I remember that. That was a big deal for me. That it was really nice of them to mention it on the commentary, and just in general. I mean, Eric Brevig, who was the director, that was his first big film, but he'd won and been nominated for. I think he'd won one Oscar and been nominated a few times in visual effects. So he had a pretty intimidating pedigree in terms of the filmmaking qualifications, and he held me to a really high standard, but really encouraged me to bring my best. And I'd had a lot of experience from working with Michael and working with Jeff on working on films, but Eric really helped me and guide me through that process, and and to get to work with someone who had worked with James Cameron and Spielberg really closely, and and also with done films with Williams and Horner and all these great Goldsmith, all these great composers. Um, he I was really fortunate to have that experience, and Brendan was also really awesome. It was a working on that film reminded me a little bit of the projects you do in school, um, where you get really into it and you have a group of friends. And as another director I worked for often used to say, the parents have to run into the room and break up the party because you get so absorbed and are having such a good time. So
Yes.
that
Yeah.
film resembled that, and I think the first Journey film, especially because it was done on such a limited budget for what they were trying to do, everyone really had to kind of come together and treat it a little bit like a school project and trying to pull the most out of every dollar we had.
The
Very cool.
on that on this, sorry to keep it on the same topic of Journey to the Center of the Earth because you have such a wide scope of music. But one of the things that John and I had found really cool when we were going through and preparing for this interview with you was in a previous interview you mentioned that a big part of your inspiration for Journey to the Mysterious Island came from time you spent in Papua New Guinea. What was it like living there and getting to know the people? And so,
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I lived there. I was actually there just under a month, but it was a pretty eye-opening month. So the way this came about, I um, interviewed when they were making the second Journey film. Eric Brevig and Brendan Fraser couldn't do it, and they hired a director, Brad Payton, and he brought me in to interview for the film. And I fortunately was hired. There were very few of us who returned. Actually, it was me, Josh Hutcherson, who was one of the stars of the film, um, and one of the two of the producers. So it was the four of us who came back. And um, what was really fortunate, that was my first film with Brad, and we've since done, I think, 7 projects together. He was the director of San Andreas and Rampage, one of the creators of Frontier. A lot of over half of the things I've done in the last 5 years were with Brad. So it was the beginning of a really amazing collaboration and friendship. And what he challenged me with is he said, this film takes place in the South Pacific, and there's a real trend in film music, or there was at the time, and there still is, to a point of kind of taking a world element and throwing it against orchestra. And there wasn't a lot at the time. There wasn't a lot of education put into that. Like, I remember when I worked with Michael Dana, I remember him commenting once that, you'll watch a movie and you'll hear a sitar over a theme over a Middle Eastern terrorist, and a sitar is 6,000 miles away in a completely different culture. So there wasn't a lot of care and effort put into staying true to the cultural influences. And Brad really challenged me and said, "Look, I'd like to hear something I've never heard before. I'd like, obviously there's going to be orchestra, but I'd like to hear a score that takes the Journey theme and takes it to a new place." And so, with my longtime friend and tech assistant Neil Parfit, we did a bunch of research, and I found this guy, Arliki Ingram, who had been born in Papua New Guinea and lived in Australia at the time. And I reached out to him and said, "Look, you're the person who seems to know the most about Polynesian, Melanesian music. How can I do a deep dive and kind of get something that is pre-colonialism, so before any of the kings and queens or Europeans went there and started influencing the music, and pre-missionaries bringing musical influence? How can I get access to some interesting musical instruments and some cultural um, uh, like ragas or modes, scales, things like that?" And he said, the only real place left is Papua New Guinea, because everything else has been so influenced by world culture. So he said, "Look, I can take you back." He said, it'll be a pretty deep dive. Like, we're going places where these tribes are closed off to the outside world. There's not a lot of influence. It's safe, but to a different standard than we're safe here. And so he offered, and I accepted, and it was a pretty epic journey. I've told Brad this before. He might be tired of me telling all my stories of Papua New Guinea, but my actual journey there in a month was probably similar in adventure level to the actual fictitious story in the film. It was it was pretty interesting, but it completely changed my life, both musically and in every other way. I've made good friends that I still have to this day there, and I was really welcomed into. I was with 3 different tribes essentially, and I was welcomed into each and treated very well, and got a really interesting insight that I think very few people will ever get into that culture. So the coolest thing that happened on that, like, I actually brought a bunch of recording equipment with me, and recorded some drum rhythms and drum rituals and things like that. And there was one point where I'd recorded something that was this rhythm that's been around for thousands of years. And I didn't end up actually using the recording, but I took that rhythm and I wrote some orchestral parts to it, and had spent this time teaching the London Orchestra at Abbey Road how to play in this strange non-Western rhythm. And it was so interesting to think of that as a way of taking it a step further, of instead of just kind of throwing a Middle Eastern duduk or some unique instrument over a Western structure, of actually building a musical cue around a completely non-Western structure. So yeah, it was very influential. And I mean, it did a few things. It changed how I approach filmmaking, score writing in every film, even things that don't have the same cultural elements to it. I write differently now, and I kind of draw from different places. Um, yeah, it was, and it also kind of showed me that I can take something I've learned. Like I've sometimes taken the Kinong or the Bonang scale and tuning of gamelan and applied that to other instruments just to try something different. And so it sort of opened up all these different dimensions to this idea of using different cultures or different music styles to influence each other, that there are many other different ways of doing it.
That is
Sweet.
so cool.
So for the next question, did you teach yourself how to compose for films, or did you work with mentors slash teachers, or is it a combination of the two?
It's definitely a combination, and I think the more this is going to sound counterintuitive, but the longer I do this, the less I feel I've conquered the skills to do it. I used to think that, okay, you get to a point where, oh yeah, I could just sit down and write anything I need to, like I've always sort of imagined the very established A-list composers that I looked up to as having that sort of lifestyle. One of my favorite comments, James Newton Howard accepted an award at a BMI dinner a few years ago. And he said, it's so nice to look out in the audience and see all the other composers that have to keep rewriting things for their directors. And it sort of reinforced that you're always learning. And the minute you stop learning and the minute you stop challenging yourself, I think you lose. You definitely lose the magic in what you're doing, but you may even lose the drive to do it. So a group of composer friends and I often talk about being in the trenches and how you put yourself in a situation where that fear that I had, that I talked about working on the first Journey film, you have it again. You think, I have no idea how I'm going to do this. How am I supposed to? You kind of put yourself, you either by doing a project that is a genre or a style you've never done before, or giving yourself limitations that you've never had before in writing. So trying to give yourself something that will recapture the magic of doing something for the first time or discovering something for the first time. One of the hardest things when I did the Percy Jackson film, they had actually temped it with City of Ember and Journey 2. And I remember thinking, I remember thinking, okay, this is going to be great because they're used to hearing my music. It's going to be easy. They've heard a lot of it already in the film, but actually it made it harder because it meant you don't want to do the same thing, and you have to reinvent yourself, and then you have to convince them. They thought they were going to get that same score, and you have to convince them, hey, no, it's going to be different, but better, different, more appropriate to your project. So anyway, the in terms of the working with mentors, um, it definitely helped. I was really lucky to work with the Danas and Michael. I primarily worked with Michael, and in the later years, did orchestration and some conducting for Jeff and his films. But Michael Dana took me on when he was working on The Sweet Hereafter and Ice Storm. He had just finished the Ice Storm, and it was around that time that I started working with him, and it was the best education I could have had. It was I remember when I did Journey, the first Journey film in London, Nicholas Dodd, who's the conductor that I've worked with for years, and I met him through Michael. He said, "Are you really scared? Are you nervous? Like this is a big deal. Like we're about to do this big session. Are you scared?" And I thought, I'm not scared because I've been sitting in this room for years as someone's right hand guy. I kind of it's like learning to ride a bike. I know what I'm doing, and um, it's a step to kind of have to run the session, but I was so familiar with the process and how it worked. So
Yeah.
um, I really owe so much to Michael and Jeff for the experience and working with them and everything I learned from them. And I recognize, um, while I was valuable to them, that there was a lot of generosity and kindness on their part in taking the
Mm-hmm.
time to walk me through and be patient with my learning curve.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, man. I was gonna, John. I want to ask a bridge off question before we go to the next one.
Yeah.
Um, or rather comment. Something that John and I have talked about quite often. And is that when, particularly with younger composers, starting out, and that's indie composers is about bringing together, composers who are just starting or have been in it a while, and would like to get some promotion and learn, especially learn. Um, and it's easy to fall. You like develop a style almost, and then it's easy to fall into that continuous style, whether it be similar chord progressions or a key, and so yeah.
Yeah, and I think it takes self-discipline to challenge yourself to not do that, but also you want to make sure you're not taking away the DNA that makes it uniquely you.
Mhm.
Because when I was starting out, there were a lot of projects where they wanted you to sound like someone else. They'd say, "Oh, I want this to sound like this score." I mean, there were years where everyone wanted The Dark Knight. I want it to
Mm-hmm.
sound like The Dark Knight. We've tempted it. It's great. What you realize is, I mean, there are people making a living doing that, and um, to a certain extent, as composers, we all have to concede sometimes to not get it our way perfectly. But what makes it really fun and what gives you a career where people look for you is to do something unique that is unique to you. Um, so the hard part sometimes is self-editing in a way that you don't take away that uniqueness, but you still um, give someone their change, what they're looking for, and accommodate their note. But I think if that's the biggest thing I tell people now is, first of all, don't try to come up with a style. You will uniquely have a style, but don't be afraid of being different than other people. I think it's all those uniqueness, it's all those things that help the evolution of film music and make it interesting today. And it's as amazing. I mean, I think John Williams is one of, if not the best theme writer in history. But I'm grateful that not all scores sound like John Williams, because
Yeah.
there's so much other great things out there. And um, yeah. Anyway.
Mm-hmm. Um, you said that we shouldn't really try to invent a genre since we sort of inherently have our own style. I think that I like probably the most inventive genres can sort of come from a composer sort of trying to find their sound first, and then sort of like referencing some other composers' work and figuring out like how their songs sound that way, and then sort of taking that and just sort of combining it with their own sound. So
I think you're right, and I think genre and style are two different things in the sense that um, I hear other composers, I can hear their style in all different genres that they do. And even though their music is really different, there's an element of a DNA that I'll think, oh, I think this is that composer or that composer. Um, so I think that's actually really valuable. And I think the great producers and directors, when you get really lucky and they sort of seek you out, they're not looking for you to do the same thing, but they're looking for you to take your skill set and your sound and apply it to something they've never heard you do before, um, which is um, something we can talk about later. But it basically brings to fact that part of being successful and enjoying this as a job is finding the people who will trust you and want to hire you for what you can do that they've never heard you do before. And that's a big difference than someone hiring you because they want you to do something that sounds exactly like Journey.
right, since when they hire you for like, since they want you to sound like something else, um, it the term that I can actually think of first is it can sort of feel offensive somewhat, I
Mm-hmm.
think.
Mm-hmm.
Though, like, if they're hiring you saying, like, so check out the soundtrack for this film, and then sort of work off from that and combine it with your sound, and that's what we really want, I suppose.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I think that, I mean, a lot of that is temp music because when they temp a scene, they can get married to it and
Yeah.
fall in love with it, and then you're sort of pigeonholed into that direction. And you sometimes have to choose: do I continue to follow that direction? Do I try to challenge them to try something completely different? It really depends on personality type whether you're going to get away with it or not.
Hmm.
But a lot of times, what I try to do is really distill into language with a director what what are you feeling from that you want to feel. And if I can get them to describe it in words and as an emotional response to that music, then I can work with that much more easily than the tempo, the key, the instrumentation, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But everybody's different. It's one of the great things I have with Brad is that each time we work together, we already have this inherent language and this back and forth that we don't have to do that again. We can kind of start on chapter 9 of the evolution of creative collaboration instead of on chapter 1. And there's a lot of advantages to that in A, how far you can go, and B, the trust. Like, we often talk about it being okay to fail. Like, hey, we're going to go down this tangent. I remember I said to him recently, we're doing a film next year, and I said, I really think I should try this. I want to do this. And he said, I can't hear it, but spend 2 weeks. Go forward on 2 weeks and see how you do. And if it's great, then we'll go on. And if it isn't, we'll go back to square one. You can't do that with a director you haven't worked with before because you can lose confidence. They can lose confidence in you, or people can fear that you're not going to get there in the end. And so I have a few filmmakers that I work with repeatedly who it's a real pleasure to have that, and to have the license to fail means you're walking the boundary of doing something unique and something interesting and finding something great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Very true. So for the next question, when you're not sure how to start slash finish a song, what helps you get over that essentially a writer's block?
Honestly, fear, deadline. You go, you realize, okay,
Yeah.
this is due in 3 days. I have to get it done, and it's funny because now I'm working on a couple of projects, and the deadline keeps going later and later until this is done, and I'm
Mm,
sitting here toiling over cues that normally I would finish much quicker, but because I don't have to wrap it up, I don't have a recording session booked, I don't have these things, I'm sitting here kind of editing it over and over and over.
mm,
In some cases, it's great, it's getting better. And in other cases, I realize it actually peaked when I would have handed it in under normal circumstances. But honestly, I think there is a you don't have a choice when there's a deadline. um, when I have friends who are writers, screenwriters, and they say, oh, my script was due 3 weeks ago, I'm going to try to get it done. And like 3 weeks ago, I'd be fired 3 weeks ago if I
Oh my
didn't
God.
hand it in. So when you realize, that you just don't have an option, you have to get it done. And if I've had moments, I've had films and TV episodes of TV where I've got a theme that I'm 70% happy with. I would love to spend a few more days seeing if I can better it, but I have to use it, and I I have to I have to make it improve it that 30% with how I treat it and arrange it and everything, and because I just don't have the luxury of the time. But
mm.
but I do that in such a way. I know a lot of other composers say they hear their music and it's never done. I do feel like it's done. I feel like I finish it and you close the chapter, and rather than working on it over and over for years to come. And I'd rather just start writing something new. I'm able to kind of put it in the past. But yeah, long answer. But essentially, um, you run out of time, and
Yeah.
you you figure out you kind of have a couple of different paths you can take in terms of themes or melodies, and you have to choose the best one and keep going.
Yeah.
I have a
Oh no, you can go first, John.
yeah, okay, yeah. I've actually felt like that exact same thing. So like y- you hate having a set time for something since you're essentially stressing for it. However, if anything, it sort of helps the creative process since you have to finish it in like, I don't know, 48 hours. It's like, oh, I gotta finish like now. I have to find something that works like now slash soon, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. It definitely organizes your thoughts, and you're forced sometimes when you're I find sometimes when you take the task of the brain away from creativity, it's creative on its own, and it's
Ooh.
subconscious. A lot of times, like, I feel like 95% of my job is writing themes, and a lot of times, I'll be doing something completely different, and I've got thematic ideas running through my head, and I'll run into the studio and sit down and record something really quick, and then I'll go back to cutting the grass, or pushing my daughter on the swing or something. Like, it just so I think sometimes what you're talking about is when you, in terms of the part of the job that is, okay, here's my recording, here's my here when you focus on the logistics, sometimes subconsciously the creative pushes through, and there's nothing more logical than a deadline that you can't afford to miss.
Right.
Oh yeah,
Very true.
100% agree on that. Actually, I
Very
wanted
true.
to kind of bridge into that and also bring up there was when I was a lot younger, when I was I think in middle school, there was this YouTube channel where this guy named Kevin Ulrich would make Lego videos, and he did a talk about it. He was eventually picked up by Lego, which was pretty cool. But he did a behind the scenes, and he said something uh, that really has just resonated. And he said, "You have to reach a point where you feel it's good enough, and then continue on with it and submit it, and publish it or put it out there." So
Interesting, huh? That's cool.
and okay, I have a burning question that I haven't been able to find anything on Google on it. So when listening to your to film soundtracks, pretty much in general nowadays, because we have all this access to VSTs that can be included, um, with I hear it a lot in take for example the space between us. You have those really cool. I think they're synth drums in the main theme of it. If you can recall, but what I wanted to ask was,
Yeah.
when you're composing music for a film, do you work exclusively with the music that you make with the live orchestra, or do you take that and then add to it in the editing room?
I'm always adding. So I'll like on Rampage, I recorded live taikos, and in the end, it's a mix of the sound. I kept some of the sampled drums as well. So you're always looking for what sounds the best, and I find sometimes it's almost always it's a combination. It's funny, there was one film score I did, and I'm trying to remember, it might have been, I can't remember what it was, but I had this really complicated woodwind part, and Nicholas, my friend Nicholas, the conductor orchestrator, came in to the mix session, just dropped by to listen to some stuff, and he said, "Wow, I didn't think they'd get it, but they really got. That's amazing. That woodwinds part. That's incredible. They sound fabulous." And I was like, "Yeah, that's my sample. They never got it. That's my sample." But he couldn't tell, and I don't think anyone else could tell. So yeah, I think it's always a mix. Space Between Us, I'm trying to remember. Yeah, there were probably some sampled drums in that. That was a cool one because a lot of the sounds, even the synth sounds, were stuff that I created, or Michael White, who's a longtime sound programmer, synth programmer, sound designer that I work with, created these amazing um, contacts. And some of them I re-recorded, and some of them I just used the contact out of these found instruments. Like there's a big scrap metal junkyard in Toronto that he went to and pulled all these huge weird pieces of metal, and we bowed them and hit them and stuff like that. So that was a fun one in that way.
That's cool.
Cool.
Um, so what do you wish you knew about composing for specifically films before you got started, or if there's anything?
Yeah. So I imagined that this job was me sitting in my writing studio writing um, 12-hour days, 14-hour days for 2 months, and then recording with a live orchestra, which um, it often is that. What I didn't realize is how collaborative it would have to be in terms of working with directors and developing relationships with producers and networking to get new jobs. And um, there's a real business aspect to this job that is way more than just writing music. And it's funny when I hear of other composers who have teams where they have lots of people writing and contributing, etc. Um, I always think that's my favorite part, is the writing part, and I can't imagine not doing that part and just being a manager of everything, because I think the politics and the relationships and presenting and that's hard. That's my favorite part, is the sitting and writing music, which ironically is what I thought was the entire job. But I realize now how much more there is to it, that it doesn't involve actually writing music. So that's probably the big thing. And relationships are so important. It's hard to get hired on a film when you know nobody. That's hard for anybody at all levels of experience. Where it gets easier is when you knock something out of the park for someone and they say, "That's my guy," or "That's my girl. They're going to be my composer on this next film," and you get brought on that way, and that makes life a lot easier because you have their trust. You don't have to win anybody over. You don't have to earn the job. So those relationships are really important, and directors move up really quickly. Like a director, I worked for a director on $100 million movie, and all he had done was one other film and one student film. So directors go really fast up the ladder, and you want to get on their team, so that as they rise, you can sort of get bigger opportunities as well, and work on bigger budget things, or better things, better projects with them. So I didn't realize how important relationships were in that way. I thought it was a much more isolated job than it is, and that would be the one thing I wish I knew.
The
Very cool.
when you talk about writing music, and particularly something that, again, John and I have discussed quite often, is there seems to be this it's probably in every composer playing by ear, but a lot of independent composers either can read music or they can't, and they solely compose by ear. Do you, a when composing music for film, do you write it out like on physical paper, and do you think that or do you feel that reading music and being able to write it is a necessity?
That's a really good question. I grew up playing by ear. I my piano teachers hated me because I struggled. Like, I think I've said this before in an interview, but I literally would. They'd say, "Can you learn these four lines of this Mozart sonata?" I'd learn the first one, and I'd get frustrated, so I'd just make up the next three, and I'd be sitting at the desk, and she or he would be like, "That's not how it goes." I'm like, "You sure it's not how?" But so I played by ear, and when I got into this, um, and I studied orchestration in university, I had to get better at reading music, and I think I use both sides of my brain now. And for the films I get hired on, and for my style of music, it's important that I know how to read music for that. That said, some of my favorite scores are not orchestral at all in that way, or they're composers who have someone on their team who are able to kind of do that side for them. So I would stop short of saying it's a requirement, but I kind of think the more you know, the better you are and the better choices you can make. So I kind of like I don't play any instruments particularly well anymore. Piano maybe okay, but everything else not great. But I've tried to learn the basics of as many instruments as I can, so that I can be better informed in writing for them and in telling someone how to play them. So I actually don't think there's any requirements, especially in this day and age, now that um, really good music is so far beyond sort of traditional Western studies. But I think there's no harm in learning as much as you can.
Very
Thank you.
good. So then, for the next question, What does your composition process look like when you're composing for a scene slash a character?
That's a good question. I tend to try not to always write for characters' themes, only because I find the interaction of characters sometimes to be a slightly deeper layer of what the music can do to help tell a story. Even in something as like San Andreas, for example, we had a hero theme, um, but Brad and I discussed early on that even though that's played a lot through Dwayne Johnson's character, other characters can absorb that and take it on because all of the characters have a moment that's kind of heroic. So I like to think of themes more in that way, and I'm always trying to look at a project in the macro sense. So when I read the script to San Andreas, I knew right away there's a hero theme, there's a family kind of protection theme, um, there's a science theme. So it was trying to write those things before actually looking at picture and seeing how it would fit a particular scene. I was trying to kind of come up with the DNA of what that would be. And in that process, a lot of times I'd sit down, not to picture, not looking at anything, but sit down at a piano or at my keyboard and say, okay, here's how this theme would be in an action moment. Here's how this theme is in a reflective moment. Here's how this theme is in a love moment. Like trying to figure all of the incarnations of that. And that's really what I do on pretty much every project. I try to figure out how versatile this theme is. And and I sometimes try to trace its evolution. If it is going to work for a story, how is it going to evolve? Where does it end? What is the version the audience hears at the end that will really get them emotionally? Excuse me, and what is the version at the beginning that will introduce them to the idea, introduce them to the melody, but might not have the same complexity as it does later on?
Mm.
So I said earlier that kind of theme writing is 95% of the job. That I feel that's the 95%. If I can figure that stuff out, then actually when I get the picture and I'm actually scoring scenes, it's so much easier because it's like I have all the building blocks. I just have to put it together. And then it's actually so much fun. Like the anxiety and the fear comes in coming up with those themes and those ideas. If you get them and you know they work and you know the director likes them, then the process of actually writing cues is really enjoyable. It's a really fun part of the process. And then there's moments of discovery where you're not second guessing the theme. There's nothing worse than, and I've done this, I've made this mistake, but I've gotten into a film where I've written the theme and I haven't totally thought it through. And I've gotten like an hour into the movie and I'm supposed to use this film and this theme in its most important part. And it doesn't work. And I think, oh my, I just wasted. I've got to go back and reinvent everything else. So
Oh,
that's part of the process. The other part of the process is sometimes scoring those key scenes. Like sometimes like what I'll do with a director or producer is I'll do a presentation. I call it a theme presentation. I say, here's the themes, here's how it's going to work at the beginning, here's how it's going to work in this pivotal moment. And I'll actually, rather than scoring it in chronological order, I'll start sketching a scene 2/3 of the way through the film or at the end of the film, which shows the potential of the theme so they don't have to imagine. I can kind of mock it up and say, this is where I think it's going to go. And once I have the approval and the trust, I'll go through and start scoring the film chronologically to picture and sketching and I actually do my mock-ups as I go. So I'll sometimes rough something in, but before anyone hears it, I'll fully mock it up so that it's pretty much as close as it can get before someone's going to hear it. So there's nothing left to the imagination.
I want to take it in a completely separate, different direction. I have to ask, do you always have this hat? Is there a story behind it? It's like the signature Andrew Lockington.
So I had long hair for a long time, and then I shaved my head, and I was like, I had all this. It was weird, and so I put this hat on, and it was right around the time that I did Journey, the first Journey movie, and I was meeting all these different studio executives and people that were important as part of the networking. And because they initially met me with the hat on, I think I had a couple of experiences where I didn't have a hat on and I met them and they had no idea who I was. They didn't recognize me at all. So it kind of became this, then people would say, "Oh yeah, you're the guy with the black hat," and it kind of became this thing and I just got used to wearing it. So I don't wear it all the time, but um, it's kind of funny. It just kind of became this thing that that's how people know me. And what's funny, like I can go to a premiere that isn't my film, or go to something, and the people can kind of say, "Hey, I saw you from across the room." So it's kind of the equivalent of having like big purple curly hair, maybe. I don't know, but yeah, it's funny.
Awesome. The oh, excuse me. Um, what has been the most fulfilling part about composing to you?
That's a good question. My favorite moments. David Arnold actually gave an interview once, and they said, "What's your favorite part of composing?" And he said, "The day I get the job and the day I finish the job are the two best days." He said, "Everything in between is really hard." I I think the the most fulfilling part, and you try to get this on every project, is when you make it through the gauntlet or the maze where you think there's no way I can do this. I have no idea what I'm doing, and you somehow successfully get through. There's a huge, it's very rewarding when you pull that off. And you can, and then the other part of it is when you're actually recording, and if it's the kind of score that has a big group, a big orchestra, it's really cool to think of something you wrote in your little studio or at your piano by yourself being played by 100 people. It's really cool. It's, I sort of equate it to what it must feel like to drive a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or a McLaren or something like that. Like it's,
Yeah.
they're taking something that you hatched in your head and making it musical. And so um, I don't know. It's not always that way. So I mean, there are the jobs that are really hard that don't feel rewarding, and um, so you're always trying to look for those little things to remind you why you want to do it for a living. But one of the misconceptions I think is that, like, when I used to write music in my room as a kid, I was doing it because it was fun. Not No one was paying me to do it. No one, it wasn't an assignment. I was doing it because it was an outlet for me emotionally, and because I got an immense joy out of creating harmonies and melodies. When it's a job, it's different. It's sometimes it feels like you're going to work. It feels like you're going to work at a store or at a factory or a restaurant or it. So you have to really try to find those things that take it back to being why you started into music in the first place. It's really important. I actually think you can hear it in people's music. You can hear the stuff they loved doing, and you can hear the stuff that they felt was a job. So I'm
Mm.
always trying to find something in the job that I love, that I can get really excited about. And I think that's, again, taking it back to Papua New Guinea, that's one of the gifts I got from that is, obviously I'm not going to a foreign country on every project, but if I can find that little piece that will inspire me, that's something I want to learn different, that I can do something unique, then that takes it out of the job kind of mentality for me.
Very cool. So in the same-ish vein, what has been the most challenging project for you so far, and why?
That's interesting. This is going to sound really cliche, but I actually don't think I have one. Because they're all challenging in different ways. Um, I don't know. That's a good question. Um, I'd say honestly, the biggest challenge for me, and the thing that always feels like a milestone on every project, is that moment when you do a presentation to people you've never worked for before and they dig your music. That so that's always the variable that you just can't count on. You have to um, that's the part when you get over that, you go, okay, I've got traction, I can climb this hill. But prior to that, you have no idea if you weren't their choice and you were hired against their will. You have no idea if they have another composer waiting in the wings that they really want to do it instead of you and they're looking for you to fail. There are all these different scenarios and you have to win people over. You have to get their trust. So I'd say that's the biggest challenge and I've had that on a number of projects. But yeah, I don't not one project stands out that was especially challenging. And even further than that, I think sometimes there's this misconception that a big budget film is more challenging than a small budget film, or even less challenging because your resources are bigger. It's exactly the same. Like the anxiety, the challenges, it's all the same. It's in the process, everything is very similar. So um, yeah, I wouldn't say there's any differentiation in that way.
Very cool.
The bridge off of that, something I've told myself when, especially when composing for film, it's sorry, struggling. Is it's not really the most challenging part for each project isn't really, having them hear your music or when the music is finished for the film and it's locked into it. It's that moment when you're first about to present it to them. It's like asking someone out. It's not actually doing the action, them hearing the music. It's everything leading right up to that moment. And
Yeah,
yeah,
you're right.
so
You're right. And it's also controlling the environment with which they're hearing it is really
yes.
important.
Mm.
Um, so I find that you sort of, and then you get superstitious because you have these, I personally, I have these scenarios where, oh, that worked out really well, so I'm going to try that again. Um, and music's different. Like I've actually done presentations for directors where they're at set, and then they're going to VisFX, and then to the edit suite, and then to a marketing meeting, and you're just another meeting. And music is different. Like you can't compartmentalize it like that. So
Yeah.
I often try to get a director at the end of the day where it's open-ended, where if we get on a roll and they're really digging what I'm doing and the ideas start flowing, that he's not going to get interrupted or she's not going to get interrupted and taken into something else. And then I also find in person versus this makes a massive difference. Being in the same room as somebody, there's so much communication that happens that isn't verbal, that isn't a two-dimensional image of you. So that also adds a challenge. So there's all these little things, but you're right. And I think that goes back to my, I never anticipated that all of those things would mean so much in terms of the job. Like if you do a poor job of presenting a theme and you don't do it well, and someone says, hey, I don't like that theme, never in my life have they come back and said, oh, you know what, I do like that theme. No matter what I do to that theme later, they're never going to like it. They've already sort of decided. I think we're all like that as human beings. You make a judgment, and it's very rare for you to go, hey, actually I was 100% wrong. So that there's a lot of pressure on that presentation because it could undo weeks and weeks of work, and it could force you, sometimes it can force you into pursuing a less good idea because your best idea wasn't presented properly.
To before we wrap up here, because we said initially 30 minutes and now it's
No,
been
this
an
has
hour,
been
so
great. No, it's great.
thank you so much for that. Question that we're kind of ending each of these podcasts with is what is your go-to snack or drink when writing music? If you have one.
I'm almost embarrassed to say, and it's going to sound like a marketing campaign for Coca-Cola, but
No
Coke,
problem.
Coke Classic. I try to limit myself to one a day, but that is my kind of rejuvenation midday
All right.
snack. There you go. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know people make fun of me for it because I don't have very many vices, but that's definitely I get up early and I write early, and when I get to around lunchtime, I start to get pretty tired, and so I don't know if it's the caffeine or the sugar that gives me a burst. And I've never tried Red Bull. I'm scared if I tried it, I'd
Yeah,
be
Yeah.
same.
writing cues at 196 or something. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, probably that.
Awesome. Well, Andrew, thank you so much for giving your time to talk with us. Just two random people that messaged you over social media. And I know that the entire indie composers community is going to really appreciate and benefit from what you have to say. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thanks for reaching out. It's nice to talk to you guys, and I'll
Absolutely.
look for your show. I'd like to. How can I see it?
We're posting it on YouTube, and John and I are talking about trying to upload it onto Spotify.
Okay,
So we're working with that as well.
awesome. I
And
can't wait to hear some of your other shows.
thank you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Best wishes to you and your family, especially at this time. So
Same
Definitely.
to you guys. Stay safe and keep writing. I'm excited to hear your scores as your careers keep going.